Authority did not collapse suddenly. It continued to function. Institutions remained intact. Expertise advanced. Systems refined themselves. Knowledge grew more precise, more specialized, more defensible. On paper, progress was undeniable. Outcomes improved. Errors were tracked. Standards tightened. Nothing appeared broken. And yet, something essential had begun to drift. People were still treated. They were still diagnosed. They were still managed. But they were no longer held. Modern authority learned how to explain problems without absorbing the emotional weight they produced. It could identify causes, recommend interventions, and predict trajectories. It could narrow uncertainty until only what could be measured remained. What it could not do was remain present inside uncertainty, in a way that felt human. This was not a failure of intelligence. It was a failure of intimacy. For a long time, that distinction barely registered. As long as results improved, people tolerated the distance. As long as procedures worked, impersonality felt like a reasonable cost. Efficiency was valued over reassurance. Precision over presence. But strain accumulates in places metrics do not measure. Pain is not only physical. Illness is not only mechanical. Fear does not respond to probability. At some point, people began to notice a quiet gap between what they were being told and what they were experiencing. Explanations arrived quickly, but relief did not follow. Diagnoses were accurate, but something remained unresolved. They were informed, but they were not steadied. This produced a new form of unease, not panic, not rebellion, a low, persistent tension that followed people beyond offices and institutions into their private lives, a sense that something important had been translated away, that their experience had been flattened into categories that no longer captured its weight. They did not doubt expertise. They doubted whether it included them. This is where most histories rush ahead. They assume that when people turn away from institutions, it is because those institutions are wrong, or corrupt, or deceptive. But far more often, the problem is quieter and harder to correct. The institution is correct and emotionally absent. Modern systems excel at resolving uncertainty by narrowing it. What cannot be measured is returned to the individual, uncontained and unresolved. And individuals are not designed to carry that much ambiguity alone. At first, people internalize the strain. They assume the problem is personal, that they are coping poorly, that others must be adjusting better, that the system is sound, and their discomfort is an exception. But exceptions accumulate, and when they do, anxiety changes character. It stops being loud. It becomes constant. It shows up as hesitation, as repetition, as the need to recheck decisions that once felt self-evident. as the sensation of always being slightly behind what is required, even when nothing is visibly wrong. This is where trust begins to thin. Not because authority has been disproven, but because it no longer absorbs uncertainty. Earlier systems had places where uncertainty could go. It could be deferred, interpreted, folded into a larger story that softened its edges. Modern authority resolves uncertainty by discarding what it cannot stabilize. That remainder falls back onto the person. And over time, that weight becomes exhausting. People rarely articulate this exhaustion clearly. Instead, they exhibit a preference shift. They lean toward explanations that feel settled rather than provisional, toward voices that sound calm rather than careful, toward answers that do not argue with themselves. This is not irrational. It is adaptive under strain. When uncertainty becomes ambient, the nervous system searches for stability wherever it can find it. It does not ask whether that stability is earned. It asks whether it works. And works now means something different than accuracy. It means relief. Relief from having to interpret competing explanations. Relief from having to weigh probabilities alone. Relief from the sense that every decision carries consequences no one else will help bear. This is the point where reassurance begins to matter more than correction. Correction requires friction. Reassurance absorbs it. Correction demands attention. Reassurance allows rest. And this shift happens quietly. People do not abandon expertise outright. They continue to rely on it for procedures, emergencies, interventions that demand technical precision. But alongside it, they begin to cultivate something else. A parallel source of orientation. One that does not interrogate. One that does not quantify. One that does not speak in likelihoods. A source that receives before it explains. At first, this supplementation is modest, a private conversation, a second opinion that feels more attentive than authoritative. Nothing that announces itself as opposition. But supplementation has a way of expanding. Because once someone experiences the sensation of being fully addressed, returning to impersonal explanation feels sharper than before. What once seemed neutral now feels cold. What was once tolerable now feels insufficient. This is how preference becomes dependency without being named as such. And this is where pressure briefly spikes. Not in public, not through conflict. Inside the individual. People notice that reassurance calms them more effectively than accuracy. That certainty, even when vague, steadies them faster than explanation. That feeling understood matters more than being correct. This realization is unsettling, because it introduces a trade that cannot be openly acknowledged. If reassurance feels better than truth, then truth becomes negotiable. Most people recoil from that implication. They do not articulate it. They move past it quickly. But the nervous system remembers, and once remembered, the preference does not disappear. This is where substitution begins. Not through ideas, through presence. Authority does not collapse. It relocates. It moves away from institutions that explain and toward figures that soothe, away from systems that refine uncertainty, and toward voices that appear to have already resolved it. This is where a figure like Edgar Cayce enters history. Not as a challenger, not as a revolutionary, not as an enemy of expertise. He does not argue with institutions. He moves around them. He does not confront authority. He softens its edges. He does not claim power. He appears to bypass it. What he offers is not extraordinary knowledge. It is relief. The feeling that someone is attending fully, without interrogation, without deferral, without friction. Because nothing is being attacked, nothing initially resists. This is the most dangerous moment. Not because deception has occurred, but because preference has quietly reorganized itself. Care has begun to feel safer when it avoids confrontation. Certainty has begun to feel humane when it does not argue. And once reassurance becomes the stabilizing force, the criteria for authority quietly change. Authority no longer rests on legitimacy. It rests on composure. Power begins to gather around those who appear settled rather than correct, those who do not hesitate publicly, those who do not revise themselves aloud, those who speak as if uncertainty has already been addressed somewhere else. This kind of certainty is contagious, especially among people who are tired. And tired people do not demand proof. They demand steadiness. This is not the story of a fraud. It is not the story of belief overpowering reason. It is the story of a system that became unable to hold uncertainty, and a man who seemed able to do so in its place. This is not a story about mysticism. It is a story about exhaustion, not about faith in the extraordinary, but about hunger for care that does not feel conditional. And because this story unfolds slowly, quietly, without villains or collapse, it is often misremembered. So we will not rush it. We will not argue with it. We will sit with it. This is a bedtime story about Edgar Cayce. And like all bedtime stories, it begins not with danger, but with the promise that someone is still awake, paying attention, while the rest of the world tries to rest. Before we continue, take a quiet moment. If you're listening from somewhere in the world right now, feel free to let us know in the comments where you are, and what time it is for you as this story reaches you. Some people listen late at night, others while working, traveling, or trying to slow their thoughts. There's no right moment for a story like this. only the one you happen to be in. And if this kind of long-form history helps you stay with the night, consider subscribing so you can find your way back again. Now, let's go back to the beginning. What changed first was not belief. It was sequence. Authority did not lose access to expertise. Institutions did not abandon knowledge. Specialists were not dismissed, silenced, or replaced. In fact, in many cases, their presence increased. More reports were commissioned. More consultations were scheduled. More data was gathered. But the order in which these things entered the system quietly reversed. Reassurance began arriving before evaluation. Calm was restored before judgment was complete. And once calm had settled, everything that followed entered a different psychological terrain. This was not an argument against truth. It was a reordering of when truth was allowed to matter. At first, the change felt minor, even responsible. In moments of uncertainty, leaders sought steadiness. In environments thick with anxiety, they gravitated toward voices that did not escalate tension. This was framed as maturity, as restraint, as emotional intelligence. Decisions made in panic were dangerous. Everyone knew that. So the impulse to stabilize before deciding appeared wise. But stabilization is not neutral. Once emotional equilibrium becomes the first condition of decision-making, it begins to shape what kinds of information are even tolerable afterward. This is the critical shift. Expertise is no longer asked, "What is happening?" It is asked, "Can you confirm that things are under control?" Analysis is no longer exploratory. It becomes confirmatory. The purpose of consultation subtly changes. Experts are still invited in, but now their role is to support a settled direction rather than challenge it. Findings that align with restored calm are welcomed. Findings that complicate it are treated as disruptive, premature, or unnecessarily alarming. Nothing is censored, but sequence matters more than permission ever did. Because once reassurance precedes evaluation, evaluation must justify itself against the emotional cost of undoing that reassurance. This is how preference becomes mechanism. No one declares that calm is more important than accuracy. No memo is written. No doctrine announced. Instead, calm becomes the environment in which all judgments must operate, and environments select for certain behaviors. People learn quickly what kinds of contributions are valued. They notice which interventions are praised as constructive, and which are quietly sidelined as destabilizing. Over time, self-selection does the rest. Those who raise concerns too early are labeled anxious. Those who persist after calm is restored are labeled difficult. Those who insist on reopening questions are seen as irresponsible, not because they are wrong, but because they are out of sync. This is the first irreversible threshold. The order of consultation reverses. Reassurance is no longer something that follows understanding. It becomes something that must be preserved while understanding is pursued, cautiously, conditionally, and never at the cost of emotional stability. Once this inversion occurs, reversal becomes expensive. To return to uncertainty would mean admitting that calm was premature, that relief arrived before resolution, that stability was emotional rather than structural, that admission threatens more than correctness. It threatens trust. So, the system adapts. It does not outlaw dissent. It reframes it. Corrections are still possible, but they now carry social cost. Warnings are still heard, but they must be delivered gently, indirectly, and preferably late. Urgency becomes suspect. Intensity becomes a liability. People begin editing themselves, not out of fear, but out of consideration. Why disturb people who are finally coping? Why reintroduce tension when nothing catastrophic has happened? Why insist on precision when the situation feels settled enough? These questions feel humane. They are also how systems drift. Because when reassurance arrives first, it does more than soothe nerves. It installs interpretation. The explanation that accompanies relief becomes the explanation that endures. The story that made the moment bearable becomes the framework through which future information is filtered. Once that happens, changing course requires disturbing not just an idea, but a feeling. And feelings resist revision more fiercely than facts. This is why reassurance is so powerful. It does not need to replace expertise. It only needs to precede it. Once calm has been achieved, new information is evaluated not on whether it is true, but on whether it threatens stability. Accuracy becomes conditional. Correction becomes negotiable. And because nothing fails immediately, the system appears functional. Order continues. Procedures hold. Life goes on. This is what makes the mechanism difficult to detect. There is no crisis moment, no dramatic error, no obvious collapse. There is only delay. Warnings are postponed because the moment feels under control. Alternatives are acknowledged but not pursued, because pursuit would reopen uncertainty. Risks are noted but deferred, because acting on them would feel disproportionate. This does not register as avoidance. It registers as patience. People tell themselves they are being measured. That haste would cause harm. That responsible leadership requires emotional regulation. All of this is plausible. But plausibility is not protection, because when reassurance stabilizes the present, it also stabilizes the future attached to it. The longer calm persists, the more invested people become in the explanation that delivered it. They begin defending that explanation, not because it is correct, but because it worked. This attachment is rarely conscious. It shows up as irritation when alternatives are raised, as subtle pressure to let things rest, as a growing impatience with those who continue to question. Those who insist on correction are no longer seen as rigorous. They are seen as unsettling. They are accused of prolonging distress, of complicating matters unnecessarily, of failing to recognize that things are already under control. This is how reassurance becomes self-protecting. Once it has stabilized a group, it begins to resist disturbance. It creates a local norm. This is how the situation is understood, and revisiting it is disruptive. Expertise still exists, but it is filtered. Findings that align with the settled explanation are welcomed. Those that contradict it are contextualized, minimized, or deferred. Not rejected. Deferred, because deferral feels responsible. Why stir anxiety when calm has been restored? Why reopen questions that have already been answered emotionally? Why introduce complexity when people are finally functioning again? This logic is difficult to argue against because it presents itself as care, and care carries moral weight. This is where reassurance begins to shape outcomes. Decisions made under its influence are not reckless. They are conservative. They favor continuity over correction, stability over adjustment, the known over the disruptive. Mistakes are not denied. They are reframed as unavoidable. Warnings are not ignored. They are treated as premature. And because consequences unfold slowly, the approach appears justified. Calm is preserved. Order continues. Function remains intact. But something essential is now constrained. The ability to revise. Once reassurance becomes the condition for engagement, revision becomes increasingly costly. Every correction threatens to undo the emotional settlement that preceded it. Every challenge risks being interpreted as cruelty rather than responsibility. So the system learns how to protect reassurance without admitting that it is doing so. Language shifts. Concerns become overblown. Alternatives become unhelpful. Dissent becomes destabilizing. No one is silenced, but fewer people speak. No one is punished, but fewer risks are taken. Authority does not harden through force. It hardens through preference. The preference for explanations that soothe, for voices that steady, for figures who appear untroubled by ambiguity. This is why figures like Edgar Cayce matter in this phase. They do not impose belief. They absorb anxiety. They do not override expertise. They displace its timing. They arrive before decisions fully form, before uncertainty has a chance to demand rigor, and once they have arrived, removing them feels dangerous. Because removal would mean reintroducing the very uncertainty they helped contain. At this point, the system has crossed another threshold. Correction is still possible, but it now carries social cost. Those who insist on it are no longer simply wrong or right. They are disturbing. They threaten not truth, but equilibrium. This is how reassurance becomes protected, not because it is believed absolutely, but because life feels harder without it. And once that feeling takes hold, the question changes. It is no longer, is this correct? It becomes, can we afford to unsettle this? By the time that question is asked, the system is no longer choosing between truth and error. It is choosing between calm and correction. And in a fatigued environment, that choice is rarely difficult. This is how reassurance stops being a supplement. It becomes a gatekeeper. What follows is not superstition. It is dependence on whatever can keep uncertainty from breaking the surface. And once dependence forms, it does not loosen without consequence. That consequence is what comes next. By the time reassurance became protected, something else had already changed. Decisions were still being made. Procedures still followed their formal paths. Authority still issued directives, and those directives were obeyed. From the outside, the system looked intact, but coordination had begun to slip, not through open disagreement, not through resistance, through hesitation. People no longer disagreed openly with conclusions. Instead, they delayed acting on them. They waited for confirmation that had already been implied. They sought additional alignment before committing to choices that once required none. This was not indecision in the usual sense. It was caution shaped by social cost. Once reassurance acquired moral weight, acting in ways that threatened it became risky. Not administratively risky, socially risky. To move too quickly toward correction was to risk being seen as destabilizing the calm others were relying on to function. So, action slowed. Not everywhere, not dramatically, just enough to matter. Projects stalled at thresholds. Decisions were deferred, pending further clarity that never quite arrived. Responsibility diffused across committees, timelines, and procedural layers, each one offering plausible justification for delay. No one objected. No one intervened. Because no single delay appeared unreasonable on its own. This is how miscoordination begins. Not as conflict, as misalignment of tempo. Some actors continued to prioritize accuracy. Others prioritized stability. Still, others prioritized consensus. None of these goals were illegitimate. The problem was that they no longer synchronized. People began operating from different internal clocks. Those oriented toward correction felt pressure to slow down. Those oriented toward reassurance felt pressure to maintain pace. And because reassurance now carried social protection, its tempo quietly dominated. This is where silence becomes active. Questions that once would have been raised early were now held back. Concerns were postponed until they could be framed constructively. Doubts were softened, then softened again, until they resembled observations rather than warnings. Silence was no longer absence. It was adjustment. People learned that speaking at the wrong moment could create more disturbance than remaining quiet. They learned that restraint was rewarded, and urgency was suspect. Over time, this reshaped participation. Meetings became calmer. Disagreements became rarer. Language grew more careful. Decisions appeared smoother. This was interpreted as progress. But the smoothness was deceptive. What was actually happening was a narrowing of viable action. Fewer options could be pursued without triggering discomfort. Fewer responses felt permissible. Correction had not disappeared, but it had lost immediacy. When action is delayed long enough, it changes character. Problems that might have been addressed early become harder to confront later. Adjustments that would have been minor become disruptive. And because disruption now threatens calm, the threshold for intervention rises. This is the first visible trade-off. Calm reduces friction. It also reduces responsiveness. The system begins optimizing for continuity rather than accuracy. It favors actions that preserve emotional equilibrium over those that resolve underlying strain. No rule enforces this. People do. They internalize expectations. They anticipate reactions. They choose paths of least disturbance. This is why the figure at the center remains silent. His silence does not instruct. It displaces. Because in the absence of explicit guidance, others act to preserve the conditions he represents. They interpret his calm as confirmation that restraint is correct. They fill his silence with assumptions aligned to stability. And because no contradiction is voiced, those assumptions harden. This creates a subtle pressure. If calm exists, action that disrupts calm appears unnecessary. If reassurance is present, urgency appears exaggerated. So when signs of strain surface, they are absorbed rather than addressed. When outcomes fall short, they are contextualized rather than corrected. When inconsistencies emerge, they are attributed to timing, not direction. This is how distortion enters. Not through lies, through delayed truth. Information does not vanish. It arrives too late to matter. Warnings are acknowledged after the window, for response has narrowed. Insights are praised once they are no longer actionable. The system begins reacting to effects rather than causes, and because reactions preserve calm, they are reinforced. At this stage, belief has already formed, but it is not doctrinal. It is procedural. People believe not in a set of claims, but in a pattern of response. They trust that restraint is wiser than urgency, that stability is preferable to disruption, that composure indicates correctness. This belief does not announce itself. It expresses itself through behavior, through who speaks and who waits, through which actions feel acceptable and which feel reckless, through which risks are taken and which are indefinitely postponed. By now, something important has been completed. Belief no longer requires articulation. Defense no longer requires argument. The system protects itself through alignment. And alignment, once established, resists correction more effectively than ideology ever could. What has not yet happened is failure. That is what makes this phase so dangerous. Everything still works well enough. The cost of delay is invisible. The harm of miscoordination has not yet condensed into a single event, but pressure has begun to leak. Not outward, inward, into gaps between action and response, into the space where responsibility hesitates, into the silence that now does work. What breaks next will not be belief. It will be timing. Miscoordination does not announce itself as failure. It hides inside routines that still appear rational. By the time silence becomes active, the system has already learned how to interpret it. Absence of objection is read as agreement. Delay is interpreted as caution. Inaction is reframed as responsibility. This is how decisions begin to make themselves. Not because someone chooses them, but because alternatives quietly expire. When correction carries social cost, the safest option is often to wait, and when waiting becomes habitual, it reshapes outcome without ever declaring intent. This is the second trade-off. Silence protects calm. Silence also transfers responsibility. No one blocks action directly. Instead, each participant waits for someone else to move first. Authority diffuses sideways. Accountability thins. Everyone remains formally compliant. No one feels fully responsible. This is where the system begins to behave differently than it believes itself to be behaving. Officially, expertise still matters. Procedures still exist. Consultation still occurs. But timing has shifted just enough that expertise arrives after momentum has already formed. Advice becomes commentary. Warnings become footnotes. Corrections become postmortems. This is not sabotage. It is adaptation. People are adjusting to incentives they did not choose. They are responding to the emotional economy of the environment. Calm is rewarded. Disruption is penalized. Urgency is treated as excess. Over time, this produces a narrowing effect. Fewer people are willing to raise concerns early. More people wait until consensus is visible. And once consensus is visible, deviation becomes costly. This is how alignment hardens. Not through enforcement, through anticipation. People begin editing themselves before speaking. They sense what will be welcomed and what will not. They learn how to phrase concerns so they sound supportive rather than corrective. Eventually, they stop raising the hardest questions at all. This is not because those questions disappear. It is because asking them feels irresponsible. Here is where the figure's continued silence becomes consequential. Because he does not contradict interpretations, others act on them. Because he does not clarify, assumptions stabilize. Because he does not intervene, restraint is mistaken for endorsement. His presence no longer reassures. It authorizes. And because authorization is never explicit, it cannot be challenged directly. This creates conflicting expectations. Some believe correction is still required. Others believe calm itself is the correction. Each group interprets silence differently. Each believes they are acting responsibly. This is where internal friction increases without visible conflict. Decisions become harder to coordinate. Actions lag behind conditions. Adjustments arrive out of sequence. What should have been small corrections now require larger interventions, which feel more disruptive, which makes them less likely. The system enters a feedback loop. Delay increases cost. Increased cost increases reluctance. Reluctance increases delay. At this point, belief has completed its transformation. It no longer lives in statements or explanations. It lives in timing. What matters most is not what is said, but when it is said. Not whether something is true, but whether it can be addressed without destabilizing the equilibrium. Truth becomes conditional on emotional tolerance. This is the moment when silence stops being neutral. It begins selecting outcomes. Not deliberately, structurally. And because the selection process has no author, it feels objective. It appears as if events are unfolding naturally, when in fact they are being shaped by accumulated restraint. This is why failure, when it arrives, feels sudden. From the inside, everything appeared reasonable. Every delay had justification. Every silence had explanation. Every choice was defensible in isolation. But together, they formed a pattern where correction consistently arrived too late. By now, belief no longer needs defense. It is embedded in procedure, timing, and expectation. Removing it would require disruption on a scale no one feels authorized to initiate. This is the final condition of this phase. The system has not yet been harmed visibly, but it has lost elasticity. When pressure increases, it will not bend. It will absorb, and whatever it absorbs next will not be silence. It will be consequence. By the time silence has become structure, the system no longer experiences itself as failing. It experiences itself as coping. This distinction matters. Failure invites correction. Coping invites continuation. And continuation, once normalized, begins to change what people expect from authority. At this stage, truth has not disappeared. Expertise has not been rejected. Procedure has not collapsed. All of it still exists, but it no longer sits at the center of decision-making. It has been displaced, not by belief, by preference. The preference is simple and rarely articulated. Relief feels better than explanation. Calm feels safer than correction. Stability feels more responsible than disruption. This preference does not announce itself as a value shift. It presents as maturity, as realism, as the hard-earned wisdom of people who have learned how fragile systems can be. The system begins to reward those who reduce friction rather than those who increase accuracy. It elevates voices that soften outcomes rather than sharpen them. It listens most carefully to those who make complexity feel manageable. None of this requires deception. It requires exhaustion. As pressure accumulates, trust begins to move, not away from experts, but toward those who make expertise feel less threatening. The system still consults specialists. It still gathers data. It still produces reports. But consultation no longer guarantees influence. Expertise becomes one input among many, evaluated not only for correctness, but for its emotional cost. Does this assessment increase anxiety? Does it demand disruptive action? Does it destabilize coordination? If the answer is yes, it carries a burden. Other voices begin to feel lighter, those who speak calmly, those who frame outcomes gently, those who reassure without insisting. These figures do not need to argue against evidence. They simply contextualize it. They place it within a narrative that feels survivable. They emphasize continuity over rupture. This is how reassurance becomes competitive, not because it is more accurate, because it is easier to absorb. At first, reassurance follows analysis. The system evaluates risk, then looks for ways to contain it. But gradually, the order shifts. Relief is sought first. Judgment follows later. This inversion is quiet, but decisive. Before committing to action, decision-makers now ask an unspoken question. Will this disturb the equilibrium we are struggling to maintain? If the answer is yes, hesitation enters. Not refusal. Delay. The problem is not denied. It is bracketed. We will return to this. We need more context. Let's wait for additional confirmation. Meanwhile, the system looks for ways to reduce discomfort in the present. This is where preference hardens into habit. The first visible failure is not dramatic. It arrives as a misfit between consequence and explanation. A decision is made that is procedurally flawless. It follows the right steps. It consults the right people. It produces the right documentation. And still, the outcome lands wrong. Not immoral. Misfitted. A warning is acknowledged, then parked. A corrective action is scheduled, then rescheduled. A threshold is raised slightly to prevent overreaction. A timeline is extended to protect stability. Nothing here looks reckless. But the window closes anyway. By the time the system returns to the problem, the cost has changed shape. What could have been adjusted has become entrenched. What could have been repaired now requires disruption. And disruption is exactly what the system has trained itself to avoid. That is the new condition. The system can still respond. It just cannot respond early enough to matter. Reassurance begins to function as a kind of emotional efficiency. It reduces strain. It lowers the cognitive load of uncertainty. It allows people to keep operating without confronting the full implications of what they know. In this sense, reassurance is not irrational. It is adaptive. Under sustained pressure, systems prioritize what allows them to keep moving. They select for inputs that preserve coordination. They sideline those that threaten cohesion, even if they are correct. This selection is not moral. It is operational. And once operational, it becomes invisible. People stop noticing that some truths arrive already softened, that some conclusions are deferred indefinitely, that some risks are framed as manageable long before they are addressed. The system has not chosen falsehood. It has chosen comfort. As reassurance gains priority, being correct begins to carry a new kind of risk. Those who insist on precision feel heavier to work with. Their presence increases tension. Their conclusions demand response. Their refusal to soften outcomes creates friction. They are not punished. They are bypassed. Their input is acknowledged, documented, and filed. But it no longer drives action. It becomes advisory rather than directive, informational rather than binding. This is not suppression. It is demotion. And demotion without confrontation is difficult to resist. Over time, those who remain committed to correction face a choice. They can continue to press, absorbing the social cost, or they can adapt, learning to frame their insights in ways that feel less disruptive. Many adapt. not because they believe less, but because they want to remain effective. This adaptation marks another shift. Truth begins to arrive already compromised. As reassurance becomes habitual, it acquires moral weight. Calm is no longer just pleasant. It becomes responsible. Those who maintain it are seen as steady, reliable, fit for leadership. Those who disrupt it, even for valid reasons, are perceived as reckless or insensitive to context. Intentions are reinterpreted through impact. A warning that causes anxiety is judged more harshly than a reassurance that delays correction. A disruptive truth is framed as cruelty. A comforting distortion is framed as care. This is not because people value falsehood. It is because they are protecting endurance. The system begins to confuse survival with virtue. By now, relief is no longer an occasional tool. It is a criterion. Decisions are filtered not only through feasibility and accuracy, but through their emotional footprint. How they will be received, how much strain they will introduce, how difficult they will be to carry. This filtering happens automatically. No policy mandates it. No ideology enforces it. It lives in habits, expectations, and unspoken norms. The system has learned what it prefers, and preference, once stabilized, resists challenge. Because challenging it does not feel like disagreement. It feels like threat. In this environment, certain figures gain influence without seeking it. They do not compete on knowledge. They do not challenge procedure. They do not claim authority. They simply reduce strain. Their presence lowers the temperature. Their words shorten deliberation. Their tone signals that things are still manageable. They offer orientation without demanding decision. This is their advantage. They do not replace expertise. They precede it, and once relief comes first, everything that follows is shaped by it. This is where preference becomes power, not through command, through sequence. And sequence, once altered, is difficult to reverse. By the time preference has stabilized, it no longer feels like a choice. It feels like common sense. Relief is no longer something sought consciously. It becomes the default condition against which everything else is measured. Decisions that preserve it feel reasonable. Decisions that threaten it feel irresponsible, regardless of their accuracy. This is the moment where preference quietly converts into protection. Not protection of truth, protection of equilibrium. And once equilibrium becomes something to defend, the system begins to behave differently toward anything that challenges it. What had once been treated as information now feels like pressure. What had once been treated as warning now feels like accusation. What had once been framed as responsibility now feels like an imposition. This is not a collapse of standards. It is a redefinition of cost. By the end of this phase, reassurance is no longer optional. It has become structural. Removing it would not restore clarity. It would expose how much has been deferred, how many decisions were softened, how many corrections were postponed. The cost of removal now feels higher than the cost of distortion. This is the irreversible threshold, not because truth is gone, but because confronting it would feel unbearable. And once a system reaches that point, it will protect reassurance at all costs. Not because it believes in it, but because it cannot function without it. This is where adaptation quietly becomes dependent. And dependence, once established, will demand a figure strong enough to carry it. Not forever. Just long enough to keep things together. By the time dependence has formed, the system no longer remembers choosing it. What began as adaptation now presents itself as necessity. What once felt like relief is no longer optional. It has become infrastructure. Decisions assume it. Language bends around it. Coordination relies on it. At this stage, reassurance is no longer something the system reaches for under strain. It is something the system is built to preserve. This is the critical shift. Reassurance stops functioning as a response and begins functioning as a condition. It sets the emotional baseline against which all information is evaluated. Facts are still allowed. Evidence still circulates. Expertise is still consulted. But everything must now pass through a prior filter. Not, is this accurate? But, can this be carried? This does not distort truth directly. It regulates impact. It allows conclusions, but moderates urgency. It permits warnings, but disciplines tone. It does not deny reality. It delays its consequences. And delay, once normalized, becomes policy without being written. The system begins to narrow without announcing that it has done so. Certain actions remain technically possible, but socially implausible. Certain escalations remain theoretically available, but practically unthinkable. It is no longer forbidden to raise alarms. It is simply understood that doing so will destabilize coordination, attract scrutiny, or trigger defensive containment. The first loss is range. The system can no longer respond across the full spectrum of what it knows. It can respond calmly. It can respond incrementally. It can respond procedurally. What it can no longer do is respond urgently without cost. Urgency now carries risk. Those who introduce it are not accused of being wrong. They are accused of being disproportionate, of failing to read the room, of misunderstanding how fragile equilibrium has become. Moderation shifts from choice to requirement, not because extremes are false, but because intensity itself is treated as dangerous. This is where constraint becomes visible. The system can still see emerging problems. It simply cannot escalate them early enough to matter. Early intervention feels reckless. Measured delay feels responsible. And responsibility, once emotionally defined, is difficult to argue against. Action is not blocked. It is slowed until its effectiveness decays. This is the new trap. The cost of acting feels immediate and concrete. It disrupts routines. It creates anxiety. It risks overreaction. The cost of not acting feels abstract and deferred. It belongs to, later, to someone else, to a future moment when clarity will be greater and coordination easier. But coordination does not become easier. It becomes more brittle. As reassurance solidifies into infrastructure, authority begins to shift, not away from institutions, but within them. Influence flows toward those who can translate complexity into calm, who can soften implications without denying them, who can explain why nothing needs to change yet. These figures do not replace decision-makers. They shape the conditions under which decisions feel acceptable. Authority becomes conditional on emotional management. This is not a conspiracy. It is a convergence. Systems under strain reward those who reduce friction. Over time, those who cannot do this are sidelined, regardless of their accuracy. The system still gathers warnings. It still documents risk. But response is now filtered through a single overriding question. Will this threaten stability more than it protects outcomes? When the answer is unclear, the default is restraint. This default has consequences. Corrections that require early disruption are postponed. Interventions that would have been manageable earlier become expensive later. By the time action feels unavoidable, it is also destabilizing. And destabilization is precisely what the system has trained itself to avoid. This is how timing failure becomes guaranteed, not because decisions are wrong, but because they arrive too late. The system begins to misinterpret its own restraint as wisdom. It mistakes survival for success. Each avoided disruption is treated as proof that moderation works. Each postponed correction reinforces the belief that calm is preserving capacity. But capacity is shrinking. The range of acceptable response continues to narrow. What once would have triggered decisive action now triggers process. What once demanded ownership now diffuses into procedure. Responsibility spreads outward, upward, forward, until no one feels positioned to act decisively. This diffusion feels ethical. It prevents panic. It protects morale. It preserves legitimacy. but it also ensures that no single actor feels authorized to break the pattern. By now, reassurance has crowded out authority in a specific way, not by overriding it, by conditioning it. Authority can speak, but only within a moderated register. It can act, but only incrementally. It can warn, but only if the warning does not demand immediate disruption. This is not censorship. It is calibration. And calibration, once compulsory, becomes distortion. The system is still capable of response. It has simply lost the ability to respond proportionally. Everything is scaled down to preserve equilibrium, even when the situation demands escalation. This is the irreversible threshold. The system can no longer choose urgency without pain. It can no longer correct without first destabilizing itself. Any attempt to regain range now threatens collapse, because the structure has adapted to avoidance. What was once resilience has become rigidity. The most dangerous part is how rational this feels. No ideology has taken over. No rules have been broken. The system remains orderly, procedural, and composed. It continues to function. But it functions within a narrowing corridor. At the end of this chapter, something fundamental has changed. The system has not failed. It has lost flexibility. And a system that cannot flex, cannot correct itself early. It can only absorb damage and explain it later. That is not weakness. It is constraint. And constraint, once normalized, does not announce collapse. It ensures that when failure finally becomes visible, response will arrive too late to prevent it. By the time defense appears, it does not look like defense. It looks like care. What is being protected is not a belief or a doctrine or even a person. It is a condition that has quietly become necessary for the system to continue functioning without fracturing under its own strain. Reassurance has already done its work. It has stabilized coordination. It has reduced visible conflict. It has allowed decisions to be made without igniting panic. Now, something else begins to happen. The system starts to test what would occur if reassurance were removed. This is the moment that reveals whether reassurance is optional or structural. At first, the test is hypothetical. What if we proceeded without it? What if decisions were framed plainly, without softening? What if risks were named directly, without modulation? These questions are not asked publicly. They circulate quietly, often as thought experiments rather than proposals. The answers arrive quickly, and they are not encouraging. Without reassurance, deliberation slows. Disagreement sharpens. Emotional volatility increases. Coordination becomes harder to maintain. Decisions feel heavier. Responsibility feels more exposed. The system notices this immediately. It does not interpret the result as evidence that reassurance is distorting judgment. It interprets it as proof that reassurance is necessary. From this point forward, the question is no longer whether reassurance is accurate. It is whether it can be removed. And the answer is no. Once that answer settles, defense begins. Not defense of an idea, but defense of a function. Reassurance is no longer treated as one input among many. It becomes an infrastructural requirement. Decisions that arrive without it are seen as incomplete. Assessments that lack it feel unfinished. Warnings that do not include it are experienced as irresponsible. This is not because anyone has declared reassurance correct. It is because the system has learned what happens without it. The defense that forms around reassurance is quiet and procedural. There are no rules written, no doctrines enforced, no penalties announced. Instead, a set of expectations solidifies. Tone matters now. Timing matters now. Delivery matters now. What is said is less important than how it is said, when it is said, how much strain it introduces. Facts are still allowed. Evidence is still gathered. Expertise is still consulted. But all of it passes through a new filter. Not a filter of truth, but a filter of truth, but a filter of impact. Will this increase anxiety? Will this disrupt coordination? Will this force decisions that cannot be absorbed gradually? If the answer is yes, the input is not rejected. It is delayed, softened, reframed, routed through additional process. This is how defense operates when it does not announce itself. The system does not silence dissent. It exhausts it. Those who insist on urgency find themselves asked to wait. Those who press for clarity are asked to contextualize. Those who demand action are asked to consider consequences. Always consequences. Always balance. Always care. The language is humane. And that is precisely why it works. At this stage, something subtle but decisive shifts. Outcomes are no longer evaluated against reality alone. They are evaluated against the presence of reassurance. If a conclusion lands calmly, it is judged reasonable. If it lands harshly, it is judged premature. If it arrives without modulation, it is judged unsafe, regardless of its accuracy. This inversion does not require agreement. It requires alignment. People learn quickly what kind of contributions travel and which ones stall. They learn which phrases trigger receptivity and which trigger discomfort. They learn how to frame concern as curiosity, urgency as patience, warning as suggestion. This learning is not cynical. It is adaptive. Those who adapt remain influential. Those who do not are gradually sidelined, not through exclusion, but through irrelevance. Their input is still accepted. It is simply no longer decisive. Over time, this creates a strange equilibrium. Everyone is heard. Fewer things change. The system begins to reward those who can translate hard realities into tolerable narratives, not because those narratives are truer, but because they preserve the capacity to act without rupture. This is where dependence becomes moralized. Reassurance is no longer just useful. It becomes good. Those who provide it are seen as responsible, steady, fit for leadership. Those who disturb it are seen as volatile, insensitive, or dangerous to stability. This is not a matter of loyalty. It is a matter of protection. The system has learned what breaks it. It will now avoid that break at all costs. This is the moment when evaluation becomes dangerous, not because dissent is forbidden, but because it is reclassified. A critique that would have once been seen as corrective is now interpreted as destabilizing. A warning that would have once been considered prudent is now framed as alarmist. An insistence on precision is reframed as lack of empathy. These reinterpretations do not require bad faith. They arise naturally from the new priority structure. The most dangerous behavior now is not error. It is disturbance. To disturb the equilibrium is to threaten the system's ability to continue operating. And once continuation becomes the primary good, anything that jeopardizes it becomes morally suspect. This is the first explicit exclusion. Insisting on unsoftened truth begins to feel wrong, not inaccurate. Wrong. It is experienced as a failure of care, a disregard for context, an inability to appreciate fragility. The person who insists is not accused of malice. They are accused of being unfit for the moment. This accusation carries weight because it feels ethical. Who wants to be the one who breaks the calm? Who wants to be responsible for destabilizing coordination? Who wants to be blamed for harm that follows disruption, even if that harm was already present? Responsibility, in this environment, shifts shape. It is no longer defined by authorship or decision. It is defined by containment. To be responsible is to keep things together, to prevent escalation, to maintain functioning. Those who fail at containment are seen as failing morally, regardless of their intentions. This is how defense completes its turn. Reassurance no longer needs to justify itself. It has become load-bearing. The system begins to act as if removing reassurance would be more dangerous than any distortion it introduces. The cost of exposure is judged higher than the cost of delay. The cost of clarity is judged higher than the cost of misfit. This calculation is rarely explicit. It is felt. People sense how close the system already is to strain. They feel how little slack remains. They intuitively understand that pushing too hard, naming too sharply, acting too decisively could trigger consequences they cannot control. So they pull back. Not in unison, not by agreement, but by shared caution. This produces a peculiar kind of stability. Not coherence. Containment. Containment holds not because it resolves tension, but because it suppresses its expression. Within this containment, something else becomes clear. The system no longer needs reassurance to be accurate. It needs it to be present. Outcomes are now evaluated not by whether reassurance explains them, but by whether reassurance accompanied them. If it did, the outcome is tolerable. If it did not, the outcome feels reckless, regardless of success or failure. This is where agency begins to drain. Decisions are still made, processes still run, authority still functions. But the range of acceptable action has narrowed dramatically. Certain moves are no longer available. Escalation is no longer possible without moral penalty. Urgency is no longer legible without justification. Directness is no longer safe. The system has lost range. This loss does not announce itself as weakness. It feels like maturity, like restraint, like having learned from past instability. And yet, something critical has disappeared. The capacity to respond early. By the time action feels justified, the window has already shifted. What could have been adjusted incrementally now requires disruptive intervention. What could have been prevented now must be managed. The system can still act. It simply cannot act in time. This is not because it lacks information. It is because it has learned to distrust the cost of acting on it. At this stage, defense no longer needs reinforcement. It has become self-sustaining. People police themselves. They moderate their own language. They preemptively soften conclusions. They anticipate objections before they arise. They avoid framing anything as decisive. This self-regulation feels professional. It feels responsible. It feels necessary. And it ensures that nothing sharp enough to correct the trajectory can survive intact. The most dangerous position now is not authority. It is absence, because the system will act regardless. If reassurance is not offered, it will be inferred. If guidance is not provided, it will be approximated. If presence is not explicit, it will be assumed. The system has adapted to operate around reassurance, not under it. This is why removal is impossible, not because reassurance is sacred, but because the system has reorganized itself to require it. At this point, There is no longer a meaningful distinction between choosing reassurance and being constrained by it. The choice has already been made. What remains is consequence, not yet visible, not yet dramatic, but unavoidable. The system has sealed itself into a form that can no longer tolerate correction without rupture. It will continue to function. It will continue to appear rational. It will continue to explain itself convincingly. What it can no longer do is change direction without pain. This is the final condition of defense. Not power, not domination, but lost capacity. And once capacity is lost, nothing else can happen except what happens next. Power does not fail when belief disappears. It changes how it justifies itself. Up to this point, authority has survived by substitution. Where belief once absorbed uncertainty, procedure absorbed responsibility. Where conviction once stabilized, decision, reassurance stabilized coordination. Where legitimacy once rested on assent, it now rested on endurance. But endurance has limits. The turning point does not arrive when people stop believing in the system. It arrives when the system stops believing it can be corrected. This is where power becomes alone with itself. At first, the system still behaves as though correction is possible. It continues to consult. It continues to review. It continues to invite critique, at least formally. There are channels. There are processes. There are assurances that nothing is off the table. But something subtle has shifted. Correction is no longer expected to arrive in time. The system has learned that waiting feels safer than acting. That delay preserves alignment. That premature correction introduces instability that is harder to contain than the problem itself. Over time, this lesson becomes internalized. The system does not stop responding. It simply changes what it responds to. Instead of reacting to the present, it reacts to projections. Instead of addressing harm as it appears, it manages scenarios that might arise. Instead of weighing evidence against reality, it weighs actions against imagined futures. This feels like maturity. It presents as foresight, as responsibility, as caution learned through experience. But it marks a decisive shift. The future becomes the primary justification for power. Once this happens, the present loses standing. Any objection can be answered by reference to what might occur if action were taken too soon. Any demand for correction can be reframed as short-sightedness. Any insistence on urgency can be dismissed as failure to appreciate complexity. The system does not need certainty. It needs plausibility. If a risk can be imagined, it can be used to justify restraint. If a consequence can be projected, it can be used to defend delay. If a disruption can be hypothesized, it can be invoked to preserve the status quo. This is where appeal changes character. Appeal is no longer denied, it is absorbed. Concerns are redirected into processes designed to manage them without altering direction. Review mechanisms multiply. Committees convene. Assessments are commissioned. Each step signals responsiveness, but responsiveness is no longer paired with correction. It substitutes for it. By the time an appeal returns from review, it has been transformed. Its urgency has been translated into language of balance. Its specificity has been generalized. Its demand for action has been reframed as a contribution to long-term understanding. What comes back is not an answer. It is documentation. Documentation proves engagement. Engagement replaces accountability, and accountability quietly disappears. This is not censorship. It is digestion. The system consumes critique and converts it into evidence of its own openness. The more it is challenged, the more robust it appears. The appearance of listening becomes indistinguishable from listening itself. At this stage, something irreversible occurs. Appeal becomes illegible. Not forbidden. Not punished. Simply unreadable as a force for change. The system can still hear concerns, but it cannot register them as reasons to alter course. Any deviation threatens the coherence of projections already in motion. Any correction risks invalidating justifications already given. Any admission of error destabilizes the logic that allowed endurance to be demanded in the first place. This is the threshold. After this point, power can no longer revise itself without unraveling. Not because revision is wrong, but because too much has been justified in its name. From here on, harm does not arrive as a decision. It arrives as procedure. No single action appears cruel. No individual choice looks indefensible. Each step follows from the previous one, justified by risk management, precaution, and continuity. The damage accumulates laterally. Lives narrow not through punishment, but through thresholds. Options disappear, not through prohibition, but through criteria. Flexibility is sacrificed not to ideology, but to consistency. Judgment is replaced by metrics designed to prevent worst-case outcomes. These mechanisms feel neutral. They are not. They encode fear into structure, and fear, once structured, no longer feels like fear. It feels like reason. This is where certainty completes its transformation. It is no longer emotional reassurance. It is institutional confidence. Confidence that does not ask whether it might be wrong. Confidence that treats reconsideration as weakness. Confidence that interprets surprise as failure of compliance rather than signal of error. At this stage, the system no longer persuades. It manages. Management expands to fill the space once occupied by judgment. Oversight increases. Safeguards multiply. Verification replaces trust. Each addition feels prudent. Each layer feels necessary. None of this appears tyrannical. It appears professional. This is how power becomes quiet, not through secrecy, through normalization. People inside the system adapt quickly. They learn which concerns can be raised without disrupting alignment. They learn how to phrase objections in ways that do not threaten direction. They learn to justify decisions by reference to future risk rather than present harm. They learn that the safest position is alignment, not accuracy. Over time, this adaptation feels natural. It feels like competence. It feels like maturity earned through exposure to complexity. It is none of those things. It is survival within constraint. The most unsettling feature of this phase is not that harm occurs. It is that harm no longer registers as harm, because it is mediated, because it is deferred, because it is justified in advance. Decisions are defended not by what they solve, but by what they prevent. Outcomes are evaluated not against lived experience, but against projections that cannot be falsified. Responsibility is displaced into systems that claim inevitability rather than authorship. This produces a peculiar moral landscape. Cruelty does not appear as cruelty if it serves stability. Suffering is tolerable if it aligns with long-term goals. Individuals become secondary to process because process promises to protect the future. This is not moral collapse. It is moral outsourcing. The system believes it has eliminated arbitrariness. It believes it has replaced subjective judgment with objective process. It believes it has insulated itself from error by removing discretion. But in doing so, it has concentrated power in the least visible place of all, not in individuals, not in offices, but in assumptions about the future that can never be tested. These assumptions guide everything. They justify delay. They excuse inaction. They frame harm as necessary cost, and because they refer to a future that has not yet arrived, they cannot be challenged by evidence in the present. This is power without appeal, not because it silences dissent, because dissent has nowhere to land. By the time consequences surface, they are already explained. By the time damage is visible, it is already normalized. By the time correction feels urgent, it is already too destabilizing to attempt. The system moves on, refining, adjusting, persisting, explaining its own necessity. This is not domination. It is exposure. Exposure of what happens when reassurance becomes structure, and structure becomes destiny. What follows does not require belief. It requires endurance. And endurance, once demanded by process rather than chosen by judgment, reshapes everything beneath it. This is the condition that remains, not because anyone designed it, but because nothing was left that could interrupt it. And once interruption becomes unthinkable, certainty no longer protects against error. It protects error from correction. That is the final transformation. Power, alone with itself. Unanswered, uninterruptible, and certain. When appeal disappears, responsibility does not vanish. It condenses. What disappears first is not morality or concern. What disappears is somewhere to send responsibility once it becomes uncomfortable. There is no longer an external horizon where error can be absorbed or corrected later. Everything must be carried inside the present arrangement. At first, this feels clarifying. Without appeal, decisions appear cleaner. Authority seems more honest. Responsibility appears fully human at last. But this clarity does not last. Responsibility, when it has nowhere to go, becomes heavy in a specific way. Every choice carries finality. Every mistake feels irreversible. Every decision threatens not just outcomes, but identity. The system reacts instinctively. It begins to look for ways to diffuse responsibility without appearing to abandon it. The first move is narrowing. Responsibility is segmented into roles, protocols, and jurisdictions. Each person is responsible for a part, but no one is responsible for the whole. Decisions are broken into stages, approvals, and reviews. This feels ethical. It distributes power. It reduces unilateral error. But it also changes responsibility's character. What was once owned becomes procedural. What was once felt becomes assigned. Responsibility becomes something one complies with rather than carries. The second move is deferral. When responsibility still feels too heavy, it is pushed forward in time. Decisions are framed as provisional. Outcomes are delayed for more information, more context, more certainty. Delay feels prudent. But deferral accumulates. Each postponed decision raises the cost of later action. Each delay narrows options. The system does not notice immediately because waiting feels responsible, not evasive. Responsibility remains acknowledged. It is simply never fully encountered. The third move is diffusion. Responsibility spreads outward into processes that claim neutrality. Metrics replace judgment. Benchmarks replace deliberation. Outcomes are evaluated against thresholds rather than values. This is where responsibility changes shape. Measurement feels safer than judgment. Numbers do not accuse. Thresholds do not demand explanation. But measurement absorbs conscience. Harm can be reframed as acceptable variance. Suffering becomes cost. Decisions can be defended as compliant even when their effects feel wrong. The system does not become immoral. It becomes anesthetized. Responsibility is everywhere. Agency is nowhere. And this is where the first misfit appears. A concern can be perfectly valid and still arrive as a routing problem. It is assigned, logged, escalated, and returned as an update. The update confirms receipt, not change. Nothing has failed procedurally. Everything has failed substantively. The system has done what it knows how to do. It simply cannot do what requires someone to step outside procedure and own the outcome. At this stage, responsibility itself begins to feel dangerous, not rejected. Dangerous. Taking it fully would require interrupting processes now essential to stability. It would mean reintroducing judgment where systems were designed to avoid it. Judgment implies authorship. Authorship implies blame. Blame threatens cohesion. So, responsibility is redefined. One is responsible if one complies. One is accountable if one documents. One is ethical if one follows protocol. This is not cynical. It is defensive. Procedure offers shelter. Procedure absorbs shock. Procedure allows action without emotional exposure. This is why procedure becomes sacred, not because it is perfect, because it protects against the terror of being wrong without appeal. As procedure expands, responsibility thins. People still care. They still sense misalignment, but their capacity to act on that recognition diminishes. There is always a step they cannot take alone, always an approval they do not have. This produces hesitation. Initiative becomes suspect. Risk aversion becomes virtue. Caution is praised for safety, not wisdom. Those who attempt to reclaim responsibility feel exposed. Their urgency is framed as recklessness. Their insistence is softened by committees designed to absorb pressure without changing direction. This is not suppression. It is exhaustion. Substitution always needs a container. When responsibility cannot be carried, it will be stored somewhere that cannot feel it. The system cannot function without absorbing moral weight. Decisions still produce consequences. Someone must explain why things continue as they are. When individual responsibility becomes too heavy, abstraction enters. Responsibility is lifted into models, forecasts, and projections. Instead of answering for outcomes, the system answers to trajectories. Harm is reframed as necessity. Error becomes inevitability. Choice dissolves into force. Inevitability does not accuse. It does not apologize. It explains. Market dynamics. Systemic constraints. Emergent complexity. These explanations feel sober and fair, and impersonality feels just. When harm is framed as system effect, outrage loses its target. Moral anger has nowhere to land. Appeal becomes illegible, not forbidden. Illegible. There is no one to appeal to because no one appears to be deciding. Authority dissolves into process. Power becomes quiet. Quiet power does not command. It produces expectation. Dissent is not silenced. It is contextualized. Urgency is translated into metrics that flatten its force. The system remains calm. Calm becomes proof of legitimacy. Legitimacy without appeal is dangerous. Unable to justify itself morally, the system compensates by becoming predictive. It intervenes early, quietly, procedurally. Governance shifts from response to preemption, from judgment to monitoring, from accountability to control. If action is taken before harm is visible, there is nothing to contest, only probability. Probability cannot be argued with morally. Power ends up alone with itself, not cruel, uncorrectable. Responsibility has become radioactive. Everyone knows it exists. No one can touch it safely. The system did not remove morality. It removed the conditions under which morality could be exercised. People still care. They still recognize harm, but they lack a pathway to act without triggering instability or blame. So they adapt. They learn the language of inevitability. They translate concern into acceptable terms. They survive inside a structure that no longer has room for unbuffered responsibility. What once justified authority now threatens it. Responsibility becomes something the system must protect itself against. Not because it is false, because it is destabilizing. At this stage, the future is no longer guided. It is audited. Decisions are evaluated for compliance, not intention. Outcomes are reviewed for alignment, not justice. Everything is monitored. Nothing is answerable. And because nothing is answerable, nothing can be resolved. The system continues. Smoothly, efficiently, quietly, until pressure accumulates somewhere it cannot reach. When that happens, the question will not be whether responsibility can be diffused. It will be whether anyone still remembers how to carry it at all. That question does not arrive as crisis. It arrives as exit that feels ethical. And that is where the next phase begins.